Welcome back. This is Family Time 203. We're looking at self-management. We're talking about stress. It's important to understand that stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Stress is only something that elicits a reaction, elicits a response. And in that way, I want us to reframe stress a little bit because stress typically has a negative connotation attached to it. We need stress. You can't adapt without stress. We can't change, we can't learn, we can't grow, we can't develop without some level of stress. The key is to find the right amount of stress. And this is something I've talked about before. We talked about this when we talked about adaptation and change. But I really want to focus on the stress aspect of this. The idea is stress exists on a bell curve, okay? It's going to be something like this, which if you have class with me, you've seen me draw before, okay? Where you're marking stress on the x-axis and performance on the y-axis. And performance is anything that you're doing. And the idea is if you have a low level of stress, your performance is going to be low. With anything. If I use the weight room as an example, even if you're not someone who lifts weights, if you're not someone who goes to the weight room, this still, I think, makes sense. If I have an athlete and your max bench press is 225 pounds, if I take you into the gym and I say, hey, we're doing sets of 5 today, and you're just going to use the bar, you're just going to use a 45-pound bar, and you're just doing a set of 5, are you going to get stronger? Well, no, absolutely not, because you're down here, okay? The stress is too low to elicit a peak performance. The stress is so little that you're not going to have to adapt. Your body doesn't have to adapt to that. On the flip side, if I'm like, okay, I want to increase your 225-pound bench, we're going to put 315 on the bar, that's going to be too much stress. We're going to be way over here, and your performance is also going to be low. You're going to take it off the rack, and it's probably going to drop to your chest, and you're not going to be able to move the weight at all. Too much stress. So we're also not eliciting the response that we want. So when we're training, we have to live sort of in this middle area here, okay? On the kind of the top of that bell curve. And a lot of times, we want to be kind of slightly to the far right side, if I'm looking at it, far right side of that curve, where it's going to be stress. If I'm using the weight room example, if we're doing sets of 5, it's maybe something that I can do, for a set of 5 for one set, and then the next set, maybe I get 4 reps and I kind of fail, or I need the spotter. That's right about where I want to be to elicit a response, where I'm overreaching a little bit. And I want us to think about that in terms of stress management with everything in your life. A lot of times we talk about stress management, people think of ways to avoid stress. That's not necessarily the best way to approach stress management. Now, there's certainly things that we can cut out of our life. That's a good thing. But you have to be able to face stress. Life is stressful, and it should be. That's how we adapt and grow. What we have to do is find ways where we can meet that stress head on, where we can meet our challenges eye to eye. So that's what we're going to talk about in classes. I want you to identify some stressors. I want you to identify some things in your life that do elicit from you an emotional response or even a physical response. I want you to identify some sort of stressor. And then I want you to think about how we can get some stress, enough stress, so that we can face a thing and we can adapt to that challenge. We talked about that a lot when we were talking about adaptation, about how, like, in psychology, let's say you're terrified of spiders, you have arachnophobia. The way to start combating that fear isn't to throw you into a room full of spiders. It's to build up gradually, where it's like, maybe, okay, Maybe we're going to start just looking at a picture of a spider very quickly. And then the next thing is maybe you're going to hold a picture of a spider. And then after we do that for a while, maybe we're going to have a spider in the room but in a container. And then after that, eventually we're going to have the spider out of the container and you're in the room. And then eventually get to the point where you're holding a spider. But that's a very long, gradual process. So that's what I want you to think about is how do we create enough stress in our life where we're adapting in those areas where we want to adapt, where we want to see growth. And that's the really important thing. If you want to see growth in an area, you have to have some stress in that area. You have to. It's the only way to get better at something, is to challenge yourself. But how do we challenge ourselves to the appropriate level where we're not overwhelmed? And that's what happens when we feel trauma of some kind, where it's overwhelming. It's too much stress. We don't have the current capacity to address that. So our performance really falls off. We're not at an optimal level with our ability to handle this thing. So that's all we're thinking of. I want you to think of things this week that are stressors, that are things that you want to address in your life, that are areas where you want to grow, and then how do we get the right level of stress for that, where we can adapt but not be overwhelmed, and then eventually move this bell curve to the right, where then eventually we're able to handle more stress, where something that was once very difficult for us becomes normal, becomes easy. All right, until next time, much love.